the symbolism and the metaphors, and looking at what these experiences in nature can teach us about ourselves and our lives and the world around us. And so I said, all right, well, let's make a show that does that weaves all those things together. And so that's how we got to Out There.
This is the Adventure Sports Podcast, where we hear stories of adventure from every corner of the planet. We interview all sorts of folks who are using their sport to explore the world around them and give you the inspiration you need to get out there and have some fun. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Adventure Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Mason Gravely, and today's a brand new episode. We're talking to Willow Belden, who quit her job with NPR to thru-hike the Colorado Trail, and not just that, because that's not an extremely long experience, 5 weeks or so, but she used the adventure to kind of be a pivotal moment in her life to kind of have the before the Colorado Trail and after the Colorado Trail experience. And so she used this adventure to give her life some space and see what she could create with it next. And so what came after that was finding and starting the Out There podcast. And so you may have heard of Out There. It's a really big show. It's a great show, and it's more storytelling rather than interviews with guests like we do on the show. So I really encourage you to go check out There. It's a great show. I really enjoy listening to it, and I think you'll really enjoy listening to Willow's story. So Willow, thank you again for being on, and without further ado, here is her story. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Adventure Sports Podcast. I'm pretty excited about this episode because it's a fellow podcaster of all things. We get those every once in a while, more and more, as more people start their own show, but very few successful podcasters we get to have. So Willow Belden is joining us today. Willow, welcome to the show. Thanks for having me. Yeah, and so, as folks heard in the intro, you host Out There, and you've been doing that for a handful of years now. But, before you got into all that, I'd love to jump all the way back and hear kind of, just quickly, like, where'd you grow up? What did you grow up doing in the outdoors? Because it's always interesting to hear people who end up in the outdoors for a living. Sometimes it starts out that way. Sometimes it's just total opposite with their childhood. What was it for you?
Yeah, well, I come from New York City, which is not necessarily known for being the most outdoorsy place.
Right.
But there was always, the outdoors was always part of my life growing up. Our family had a cabin up in Maine on a lake. My grandparents had bought land up there way back when it was dirt cheap and built this cabin. And so all throughout elementary school and high school, even into college, I would often spend summers up there kayaking and hiking and just playing around the woods. So I think a general love of the outdoors got instilled there. But it didn't really sort of take on the kind of proportions that it has now until I moved out west, which I did. I had just finished grad school and I got a job with Wyoming Public Radio, which is the NPR station up in Wyoming. And I didn't really know anything about Wyoming at the time, but I figured, well, it's a good job. I will go out there for a year or two and then probably move back to the East Coast. And here I am still in Wyoming 9 years later. So I love it here.
Wow. Where was the job based in Wyoming? Because I'm sure that could make a big difference.
For sure. Yeah. I was in Laramie, which is where the University of Wyoming is. So it's a college town. And, it's not one of those picturesque mountain towns that becomes a tourist destination. It's much more sort of down to earth, little rough around the edges, but also, has a wonderful, vibrant community. So it's been a great place to live.
I was just in Laramie, like a month ago, on a cross-country bike ride, of all things.
Oh, wow.
Kind of a weird time, but I have a good friend in Cheyenne. Same thing. Finished grad school, finished school, and took a job working for the newspaper in Cheyenne. And she's still there too, so it must be something about just drawing people out there and keeping them. That's really interesting. So you went out there, didn't know much, and you joined Wyoming Public Radio. What was that experience like? Because it sounded like at the time it was a dream job for you. Just didn't know much about the place itself, but the job itself seemed like really what you were shooting for.
It was. I mean, I had always grown up listening to NPR. My mom had it on in like every room of the house. When I was growing up, she would wake up and she had, that was back before smartphones and stuff. And so you listened on actual radios, and she had a physical radio in, I really think, every room of the house, including the bathroom, so that wherever she would move around the house, there would be Morning Edition would be playing. And so I think it just got, I don't know, I didn't really have a choice in the matter. But I kind of came to aspire to reporting for public radio. And so then I worked my way up to it. I had worked for some smaller newspapers, and then went to grad school for journalism and focused on radio. And then, the job at Wyoming Public Radio really was exactly what I wanted. I was reporting and also hosting. So I got experience putting together news stories, being live on air, editing, doing the whole thing. We had a lot of freedom to pursue stories that excited us. And we also had a really wonderful team. It was a small newsroom, so we all did a lot and we worked hard. And I loved my colleagues and I loved my boss. And it was, in many ways, it was exactly what a job is supposed to be. It's, you have wonderful people that you work with, and you feel like your work is meaningful and it's different every day and it's creative, and people get to know your name and all of that. But I didn't love it enough to make it worth the amount of stress that it was. I think news jobs in the broadcast industry are pretty high powered. A lot of deadlines that are very, very exacting. If your deadline is 4 p.m., you can't be done at 4:01. And it was, and I didn't love it quite enough to make it worth it. But I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do instead. And I think that's something that a lot of people run into. Like you feel like it's not, whatever you're doing isn't quite the right fit, but you don't know what would be a better fit. And I finally got to the point where I said, I think I need to just get away from everything for a little bit so that I can figure that out. And so I ended up quitting my job and going and doing a thru-hike.
Right. The Colorado Trail, of all things. Well, let me ask you this. What about the world? I obviously nothing against NPR. I'm a huge listener. What are some maybe misconceptions about that world that you just didn't see on the outside? Like, is it the deadlines probably being the biggest one, or something else?
I don't know that it was that I had misconceptions about what the job would entail. I think I had misconceptions about what I would like as a job. Because and I also had a very rigid sense of what it meant to be a journalist and what was an acceptable job as a journalist. And I thought you had to be like a hard-hitting news reporter, and that was the only, in my mind, that was like the only path, the only track, the only destination was to be doing that kind of thing. And in the end, it turned out that wasn't what I enjoyed most about it. I love telling stories and I love working with audio, but I didn't enjoy news reporting as much. I much more enjoy doing what I'm doing now, which is more in-depth, sort of contemplative personal stories. So it wasn't a misconception about what the job was. It was, I think I had pretty accurate ideas of what I was getting myself into. maybe didn't know or maybe hadn't accepted that what I was going to enjoy doing wasn't that job.
So what was the ultimate, I don't know, what made you say, okay, because of all this, it's not right for me. I'm going to go do something vastly different. You know?
Yeah. Well, I remember at the time, I just kept having this quote that kept kind of running through my mind, and it was a quote that went, and I may get it slightly wrong, but basically the gist of it was, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And I thought, yeah, that's where I'm headed. Like, I wasn't quite in the desperation phase really, but I said, if I just keep doing this because that's what you do, that's where I'm going to end up, and that's not what I want out of life. So that had been kind of kicking around in my head, and several things came together kind of at the same point. One was that I read Wild by Cheryl Strayed, which at this point everybody's read Wild by Cheryl Strayed, but it was new at that point. And I immediately just had this reaction to it of like, oh, I need to go do that. And I mean, in case anyone hasn't read it, the premise of it is this woman who her mother dies, and she gets a divorce, and her life is totally unhinged, and she goes and hikes the Pacific Crest Trail and kind of figures her life out through that. And it's a wonderful book, and so I remember reading this. My book club had suggested reading it, and I remember starting the book, reading in bed one evening, and I must have stayed up until like 4 a.m. reading it and just sobbing my way through the first few chapters because they hit home so acutely. And I remember thinking, okay, this is what I need to do, because I don't want to be heading in this quiet desperation. That's not what I want. And maybe what I need is just to leave everything behind for a little while and go on a big adventure, and have some time to myself to think deep thoughts and figure things out. And I was not a backpacker at all then. I had never, I was totally new at it. So I'm not entirely sure what made me think that this was a feasible option, but it just felt so viscerally right that I just once I got the idea in my head, I just couldn't let go of it.
So, you have this idea, you have this realization, you want to do this. What were the most influential people in your life saying about this, if you were communicating it with them?
It was interesting. There was a generational divide. I would say that people my age, so friends who were in their 20s and 30s at that point, were quite supportive of it, and they all thought, oh, yeah, that sounds great. You should totally go do it. People of my parents' generation, and my parents weren't alive at this point, so they didn't get a chance to weigh in on this. But I remember having a conversation with my uncle at one point about it when I was first thinking about it. And he said, well, are you sure it's a good idea? Because you're proposing quitting your job, and you don't have a new job lined up for afterwards. You don't know what you're going to do afterwards. You're going to have this gap in your resume. That might not look good. So there was some skepticism there. It wasn't, nobody said, no, don't do this, it's a terrible idea. But there was definitely a little bit more hesitancy, I would say, amongst people who were a little older than me. And I kind of, my response to that was sort of, well, if somebody doesn't hire me because I thru-hiked the Colorado Trail, I don't want to work for them.
Right.
That's just not the right company for me. So I went ahead with it.
That's just so interesting. As I get older, I can see both sides. I don't know if you can. I'm sure you can. You can see, like, I'm sure at the time, even it was like, I see what you're coming from. But that quiet desperation, when you sit and think about that, it really can encourage you to say, what really all is all this for? It's 500 miles to do the Colorado Trail. It's a month or two of my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like I'm setting out to walk across, a continent necessarily for years or something. It's something that can really shake up your life. But, not being experienced either had to be just such a crazy idea. What was it like when you finally decided I'm going to do this? I don't know. What did it feel liberating at all? What was that feeling like? And then what was it like to plan for and to go for it?
It did feel liberating. I think it was scary and liberating at the same time. And it took me a while to muster up the gumption to actually quit my job, to tell my boss I was leaving. Because it's just something that you're not supposed to do, right? Like, you have a really good job that checks all the boxes and gives you a stable income, and you like where you live and you like your colleagues. And so, it did
great.
take a while. Yeah, right. Like, it took a while to say, okay, no, really, I'm quitting. And I remember when I told my boss, that I was going to be leaving, I go into his office and I tell him about my plan to hike this trail. And he looks at me, there's this pause, and he looks at me and he's like, so you're leaving us to go take a walk in the woods? And
Wow.
I was like, well, yeah, I mean, pretty much that is in fact the plan. And it was not what most people, because people would leave the radio station, but usually they would leave to go take another public radio job at a bigger stations, in a bigger city somewhere. So this was a little bit out of the ordinary, but preparing for it, I mean, I didn't have backpacking experience. I had only gone backpacking a handful of times, and I had never gone by myself, and they had always been really short trips, 1 or 2 nights. So I did what I kind of always do when I don't know anything about a topic, is I just read a lot of books about backpacking and about through hiking, and I did a ton of research on gear to try and figure out what I would need, and that worked out pretty well. I mean, I have to say, I think, one of the questions I often get is, well, what did you do wrong on that hike? Because people assume that if you're going into this as a newbie, you're going to do a lot of stuff wrong. And, I didn't bring too much stuff. I didn't pack the wrong things. I had done a lot of research, and it paid off. The trip was very difficult for other reasons, but not because I hadn't done my research. So it was sort of a bookish kind of preparation period.
What do you tell people now when it comes to, I feel like I'd like to do something like this. How much do I need to prepare, especially for something solo? That's you did it in 5 weeks. That's not a weekend. It's not 6 months, but it's pretty much the same as 6 months in the sense of the lifestyle. It's just on a longer scale. You know what I mean? You're really into the through hiking experience after just a few days, in my opinion. And so anything longer than that is pretty much just the same thing, just more days of it, if that makes sense. So you are absolutely a through hiker with that experience. But what do you tell people about being prepared for something like that?
People haven't asked me about that much. I mean, in general, I encourage people to go for it if they want to do a through hike and they really feel a sense of personal urgency for it. Go for it. You're not going to regret it. And it'll probably do wonderful things for you. But in terms of preparation, I do think that it is helpful to prepare and to know what you're getting into and to know what you need. I actually think it can be a little bit reckless if you go into the backcountry for a long period of time and don't have the things you need, because then if something goes wrong, you're very reliant on other people who might then have to put themselves at risk to help you. So I think it's important to understand that you know how to be self-sufficient. But I don't think you have to do the level of research I did. I mean, if you do some things wrong and you bring some of the wrong gear, it kind of makes for good stories afterwards. People figure it out. You don't have to have a whole bookshelf on how to do a thru hike the way I did. I just like to plan things. It makes me feel a little bit more in control.
Right. So, speaking of that, why the Colorado Trail of all things and not something maybe longer to give you more time to think,
Because I wasn't sure if I would like it.
Right.
I had never done it. I had initially thought, I had been looking at some of the longer trails, and I had thought about, do I want to do a little bit of the AT or the PCT? And I didn't really want to do the Appalachian Trail because I don't really like hiking in the rain, and I don't really like hiking in the mosquitoes, and I like to have views. So the Appalachian Trail didn't seem like maybe the best fit for me. And I considered some of the other trails, but really it was, I say that jokingly that I didn't know if I would like it, but I really didn't know if I would like it. And so this seemed like a good way to get my feet wet and try it out. It seemed like it would be long enough to sort of let myself press reset and figure some things out, but it wouldn't be so long that if I really hated it, I'd be, in it for 6 months.
So you get out there, and from what I remember you saying, you did have a lot of rain that you didn't really want, and there wasn't as much time to think throughout the day that you would hope to figure your life out after the trail. I'm not sure if I remember that correctly, but could you touch on that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there was a lot of rain, much more than I expected, but you deal with it. But yeah, the thinking, I think I had imagined myself walking along, on these alpine ridges through the Rockies, just thinking deep thoughts all day. And what I found, and I think this was true for a lot of thru hikers too, a lot of us talked about this, is that you didn't really spend a whole lot of time thinking deep thoughts. I'm not sure that I really had hardly any deep thoughts the whole time, because it's thru hiking's hard. I had blisters on my feet, and there was rain, and there were mosquitoes. Maybe not on the level that the Appalachian Trail would have them, but there were bad mosquitoes, and there were hailstorms, and there were lightning storms, and my sleeping pad broke, and you had to figure out whether you had enough water to get to the next water source, and all these things. And so I found myself much more focusing just on what was actually just going on around me, the very mundane tasks of doing a thru hike. And I didn't spend a lot of time, there was no moment on a mountaintop where the clouds parted and I was like, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. That didn't happen. But I don't think it's necessary, because what ended up happening was almost better, because I think even though I didn't have the deep thoughts on the trail, I was creating a mental space for myself, and I didn't know that at the time, but I think I gave my mind a little bit of freedom. And so what ended up happening was that after I got done with the trail, I got home, and a few days after getting home, the pieces started falling into place. And that's when I started having more of the sort of life realizations where I said, oh, okay, I don't want it this way. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit that I didn't actually want to go back to news reporting. I still wanted to work in audio. I still wanted to tell stories, but I didn't want to go back to doing daily news. And I let myself, not just think that, but say that and admit it to people. So the realizations happened right after the trip. And I think that's true for a lot of people, that you don't necessarily, you're in the middle of the adventure while the adventure is happening. And it's then afterward that your mind is able to think about what's next.
And what were some of those things? You had the realization that you didn't want to go back into daily news. What started getting, becoming put together in your mind at that point?
Well, I had the idea for some sort of an outdoorsy podcast for a while. But I hadn't really done anything about it because I didn't have a clear focus in mind. And I also, when I had a full-time job, I just didn't really have time to pursue it. And so now things sort of started clicking into place. I said, okay, I still want to do audio. I still want to tell stories. I don't want to do news. I had this idea for an outdoorsy podcast. Also, like, I think, having had this big, long 5-week experience in the outdoors, I've seen that nature can kind of be a good way for a good lens for figuring things out. And, maybe stories of the outdoors can do that also. And so I said, okay, let's see what we can, let's try and put some of these things together. And that's when I started coming up with sort of conceptualizing what out there might look like. And it was one of those things where, there were already a lot of other outdoorsy and adventure related podcasts out there. And I didn't want to do something that someone else was already doing. And also what interested me most about the outdoors and stories of the outdoors was not so much just the pure raw adventure, but more the life lessons and the symbolism and the metaphors, and looking at what these experiences in nature can teach us about ourselves and our lives and the world around us. And so I said, all right, well, let's make a show that does that weaves all those things together. And so that's how we got to Out There.
That's fantastic. Now, how did you start? What did you start? What did you start with? Your own story? Did you knew about the gear, you knew about storytelling, and you had that passion in place. Where did it go from there? Did you start telling people about this? How did you process all that?
I actually did not start with my own story, although perhaps I should have. But the journalist in me, it didn't occur to me that was an option, really. I don't think. Right. I was like, no, you tell other people's stories. That's the way this works. So that's what I started with. And the very first story we did was about a scientist up here in Wyoming who went and lived with a herd of deer and basically tried to become a deer. And you listen to this, on the face of it, it sounds kind of goofy, but I went to interview him and I spent all afternoon with him. And he lives in this house out just nestled beneath the Wind River range. And his yard is just chock full of deer. They just wander right up to him, eat out of his hand and whatnot. They're very much his friends. But so I interviewed him and realized, okay, there's a lot more to this than this isn't just, some goofy guy. This is actually, he's really trying to understand their behavior and understand their thought processes. And his point was kind of, a lot of times we think of science as being sort of very, very objective, very, very just let's look at the cold hard facts, and you try to leave emotion out of it. And you're not supposed to get attached to your research subjects. And his point was sort of, you miss some things that way. There are things that you actually learn by becoming close to the things you're studying that you would never learn otherwise. And so we maybe shouldn't have quite such a rigid view of how science works and what the process should be like. So that was the very first story we did, and it kind of set the scene for how we conceptualize stories now, where I'm always looking for, the story has to be about the outdoors in some respect, but it also has to be about some broader social question or scientific question or psychological question, and kind of delve into how we function as humans and how we operate in the world and what our place is.
Did this pursuit solve that, what you were trying to find, by waking up and being excited in the morning for what you were doing?
Yes, absolutely. I love what I do now. It is it's wonderful. And I'm actually largely a lot of what I do is editing at this point. Many of our stories are done by freelance producers from around the country and around the world even. And so a lot of what I do is help them turn their ideas into stories and help them focus and help them, figure out what the narrative is and really hone them. And what I've discovered is that I really love doing that. I actually like the editing more than I like writing my own stories.
Okay. Wow. So somebody has to like it, I guess.
And it's been really fun. It's a very collaborative process. And I learn a lot along the way. I think other people learn a lot along the way. And I mean, I'm not going to lie. There's times where I really miss having a steady paycheck and benefits and, all of that. But I love what I do.
And this was back in 2015 that you started out there.
Yeah, I started out there in 2015, and I don't know that I fell in love with it right away. It was a bit of an uphill battle initially. It's hard when you're starting out from scratch, it's hard building up listeners and getting people to know about your show and figuring out. I mean, I knew how to do audio stories, but I didn't know anything about business. And here I was trying to start a podcast and turn it into a business that would eventually, be financially solvent. And so that was really hard. And it's still really hard. And but again, the actual craft of what we're doing is, I love it more than I thought you could love a job. So that's worth something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that when you went out on the Colorado Trail, you read, you did some research, lots of reading, and then you just went for it. Did it feel similar in this way to start the podcast and to make it financially stable? I know that probably ebbs and flows like any other thing you start, but from your perspective, did that initial adventure give you this confidence to walk into this and say, I'm going to figure this out too?
Yes, 100%. It was, I tend to be the kind of person who, I don't like being a beginner. And maybe nobody does, but I think some people dislike it less than others. I really don't like being a beginner. I like to be good at things. And so when you're starting something new, you by definition are not good at it. That's just how it works.
You're a beginner.
But what I reminded when I was thinking about launching a podcast and going into this whole unknown realm, what I said to myself was, okay, you didn't know how to do a thru-hike either before you hiked the Colorado Trail. You barely knew how to go backpacking, but you figured it out. You wanted to do it, and you wanted it enough that it was worth putting in the time to research it and do your homework and figure it out. And I mean, I remember very literally having that conversation with myself as I was thinking, but I don't know how to start a podcast and I don't know how to run a business. And it was like, well, yeah, okay, so figure it out. Do some research, talk to people who know what to do, get people on your side, and try it. Give it a shot.
Do you feel like that has served you well most of the time in growing this show and building it to what it's become?
I think it's very necessary. I don't think you can start something new without being willing to try things you don't know how to do. I mean, maybe that's obvious, but yeah, I think it has served me well, and I think I still tend to be more cautious than I should be from a business perspective. But I try to take the approach of, let's try things. Let's see where they go. If they don't work out, well, then we move on. And I think it's a good philosophy for life.
Absolutely. You started the show in 2015. That actually is when this show started too, February of 2015. And, the world of podcasting has changed a lot in 5 years. And And I'm sure you've seen shows just come and go. The rise in the interest in podcasting. It's like every other guest we have on now has their own show too. How have you been able to stay ahead of this giant curve of shows and also continue to just stay so consistent in creating a great show, a great product, and something that people want to listen to?
Well, I don't know if I've stayed ahead of the curve. I've tried to keep up with it.
Yeah, NPR has some pretty good shows, but you know what I mean? But yeah, there's definitely some huge ones out there. But you look up outdoor shows or adventure shows, and consistently every time I search, just checking in with the industry, yours is right there at the top of the list, and so it definitely has a strong listener base.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that I did. One was I've been very clear from the beginning, very clear with myself that I wasn't going to sacrifice quality for quantity. And it was important to me to really put time and effort into our stories. And that means you can't do as many stories because they just take longer to put together. I mean, many of our episodes are in the works for several months before they actually air. And a lot of people early on were saying, "Oh, just do more interviews, do more things that don't take as much time, get more episodes out more frequently." And I just said, "No, I don't want to do that." So I think that helped in the consistency of, like, in the quality consistency. And so our listeners realized, okay, if we tune in, we're going to get really carefully crafted stories. So that was sort of on the content end of things. And on the other end of things, I mean, I don't have any magic recipe, but it was a couple of things were important to me. One was it was important to stay on schedule. So if, like, we produce episodes every other week and we have never missed one. And that, I think the consistency of, like, it's going to be there. They're not going to, we don't miss shows. That's been helpful. But the biggest thing I think that has contributed to the show actually going somewhere is surrounding myself with other people who have skills and interests that I don't have. And I think this goes for probably any business you're starting, that I realized very early on that I didn't have the expertise or the know-how or the interest to really spend a ton of time figuring out how audience growth worked or figuring out how to sell ads or things like that. And so it was like, okay, well, then you need to have other people on your team who like doing that and want to figure that out. And that's been great. Just surrounding myself with people who are excited to do the things that I am not excited about. And that's been very rewarding. But it is interesting. You're right in terms of the, so much has changed in terms of podcasting in the last 5 years. Because I remember when I started out there, if I told people, oh, I host a podcast, often the question was, what's a podcast? And now
100%. Yes.
Yeah, and so that was 5 years ago. Now, I mean, I just I just went on a date with somebody and I was telling my friends about it, and I said, "Oh, he didn't know what a podcast was." And all of my friends said, "How could you not know what a podcast is?" And I was like,
Wow.
Times have changed. This is like, my friends would not have had that response 5 years ago. It would have been like, oh, okay, so he doesn't know what a podcast is. So
I thought you were going to say those same people are now saying, "Oh, I have a podcast too."
No, they don't. But it was just interesting to see that, like, the shock at, like, how could you not know what a podcast is? Everybody knows what podcasts are. So
yeah, especially the folks you're going to be interacting with. Like, I'm from rural town. They're definitely not podcast listeners, but all my family absolutely knows what it is now, because I pretty much, shove it down their throat every time I'm around. I'm like, oh, the podcast, this, that, and they've been exposed to it, and so that is how it grows. But it is interesting to see the growth over the last 5 years, really. And so, I definitely, you mentioned this, and I wanted to talk about this. It's always interesting to hear from someone who works in the outdoor industry, who tells stories about the outdoors. What is it like to turn something that you're passionate about into something that is also a job? I know there's a lot that you got to be careful of, and there's a lot of misconceptions, but how has that experience been for you to take this experience you had, this life-changing experience, really it was the kind of the soil that this whole show grew out of. What is it like for you to kind of have to live this life in a totally different trajectory based on that adventure, and kind of talk about adventure all the time for a job as well?
I like that image. It was the soil that this show grew out of. Yeah, no, that's a good question though. It's tough because when you start doing something when your work is what you do for fun, then you don't have any playtime anymore. Then everything becomes work. And that I kind of figured out the hard way, because I started the podcast and I thought, oh, this is going to be great because, I love the outdoors and this is what I do for, it's so much fun. But then every time I went for a hike or a bike ride or went skiing or whatever, what was then swirling around in my head was, oh, is there a way to turn this into a story? Should we should I be recording right now?
Taking pictures for social and promoting in some way.
And it was, and for a while I thought, well, I guess this is just how life is going to be now. All right, buckle up. And then I remember at one point I was planning to go to Idaho to do this bike packing trip. And in my mind, I was like, all right, I'm going to turn, it's like I'm going to do like a little mini audio documentary about it. And I was going to take recording gear with me and all of that. And so I had started kind of preparing for that. And I was recording stuff as I was doing preparations and getting my bike all tuned up and ready and things like that. And it was just, I found that I was not looking forward to the trip anymore because it just felt like work. It didn't feel like it was going to be a vacation. And that was sort of the point where I said, okay, I need to draw a hard boundary here. There needs to be separation between work and fun. And some of my trips can be work trips, but other ones really need to be vacation. And I need to leave the recording gear at home, and I need to leave my computer at home, and I need to promise myself that it will not become a story, and at least not intentionally. And just let myself off the hook for that. And I have stood by that since then. And that has been very necessary. And I'm sure other people run into this in whatever their field is, that, everybody says, do what you love. And that's good advice. But you also need to recognize that you need time where your brain is not thinking about work, even if the work is fun. So.
No, that's, I'm sort of, I can be open about it on this show with listeners, ever since taking on this role as host and producer. Yeah, my frequency of adventures is a lot lower. And part of that is, it definitely is positive in a lot of ways and negative in some, because, I don't get to do as many adventures now. And that's because I'm pretty bad at setting boundaries. I'll just work. But the other part is, the trade-off is I do get to talk to really incredible people like you, and do get to talk to all these incredible folks. And I learn a lot from these people. And it's almost like this is just a time I'm in. You know what I'm saying? And so I could definitely learn from you in that aspect about creating some healthier boundaries, to not working towards an inevitable burnout or something like that. So no, it's just, it's always interesting to talk to someone in the industry as well. So, you've seen a lot of growth over the last 5 years, a lot of success. I don't know how it feels to you. It sure seems like that, but you definitely one of the premier shows for the outdoors. You rated the #1 outdoor show on Apple Podcasts. Is this kind of, the trajectory you were hoping for when you got off the trail And if not, what is in the future for Willow? What are you looking forward to, and what are you hoping the next 5 years will bring for the show or for your life in general? Very, very small question.
Yeah, go big or go home, right? I mean, one of the big goals, sort of on a business standpoint, is we're really trying to grow our audience. We want more people to listen to the show. And part of that is just because you want more people to listen to the show. And part of that is because, you can bring in more advertising revenue if you have more listeners. And I want to be able to pay my team well. And so, this is not me trying to get rich. This is me wanting to compensate people fairly for their time. So we really are trying, doing some major efforts to try and reach new listeners who may not have heard about the show. One of the things that is, but on a more sort of content level and a bigger picture level, one of the things that I really am making an effort to do at this point is broaden the definition of what the outdoors is and what it means to people and who it's for. Because I think there's a lot of media coverage about the outdoors centers around upper middle class white people, and I think that's sort of a detrimental image that we have, because it defines outdoor adventure very narrowly as being like, mountain climbing and skiing and, long distance cycling and all these things. And that leaves out a lot of experiences that I think can be extremely meaningful and that, frankly, are often more interesting stories. One of the things that we hear a lot from producers of color who do stories for us is that they hear over and over again the messaging that they get is the outdoors isn't for me. That's something white people do. And that sort of negates their own, or not negates, but it diminishes the sort of validity of their own experiences outdoors and makes them feel like they're not, like they don't belong and they're not welcome. And then, the cycle just kind of perpetuates itself. So we're working really hard to try to tell stories that encompass a wider variety of experiences and perspectives and viewpoints, and sort of embrace this idea that it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. The outdoors should be equally accessible to everyone, or at least we would like to aspire to that, and we want to tell stories that showcase that notion and that amplify voices that are not often heard in outdoor media and that often get sidelined. So that's a big goal, but hopefully we're making strides with it.
Do you have an example that fits into that kind of overlooked either activity or sport or story? I mean, no spoilers, of course, but something that listeners can relate to.
Yeah, for sure. We had a story a while back about a woman who is, she's Latina, and she was adopted by white Jewish parents. And so from day one, she's, the question of identity and who you are and like how you fit in was always kind of front and center for her. And then she eventually sort of figures it out and figures out who she wants to be. And then she realizes, society isn't going to accept that. And so then she has this whole nother level of trying to reckon with that. And it gets to, she ends up in a place where she's become an avid rock climber and super outdoorsy, and, people know her as Nature Wendy because she's just outside all the time and doing all these outdoor things. But it was a process for her that really required not just figuring out, okay, I can do these things even though they are white people, stereotypically white people things to do. But also, not only can I do these things, but I just have to be okay with the rest of the world not. I have to not care what other people think about it. And so it was like a two-step process, challenges on both levels. And I thought that was a really interesting story.
Well, it sounds that out there has now an even more new frontier to start exploring and start telling stories about, which has to feel exciting. To draw this full circle and all the way back. What would you tell the person that might be in a job kind of like you were in? It's a great job on paper, or life is good, but there's this this kind of simmering, bubbling, quiet desperation that they feel they're slipping into. And they feel like they want to do something about, but maybe don't know what to do, where to go. What is a quick reflection you could share with yourself, from 5 years ago?
It's a little more complicated in the middle of a pandemic and an economic slump.
Is it?
I mean,
Yeah.
If you'd asked me this last year, I would have probably said, yeah, quit your job, go on an adventure, figure it out. I don't know if that's the right thing to do now. Stability's kind of nice and when the world is being turned upside down. I mean, and I also recognize that, so I don't know if I have a clear-cut answer for that. I also recognize that not everybody can afford to just pick up and leave. That's a very privileged thing to be able to do. I had savings set aside that I was able to live off of while I, went out and wandered around the woods. And if you don't have that kind of cushion, it's a lot harder to quit a job. If you have family members relying on you, it's a lot harder to quit a job and leave everything behind. So I don't want to just cavalierly say, yeah, go quit your job. I don't think it's quite that simple. But I do think that even if you don't necessarily run away from everything, sometimes there's a way to reshape what you're doing so that you're a little bit happier with it. And I realize that's not super concrete, but the quiet desperation doesn't go away. I mean, that's not something that's going to let up. So I guess the easy answer is if you have the means to do it, then go do something different. And if you don't have the means to do it, maybe try to see if there's a way that you could shake up your life a little bit without throwing everything away that would give you the freedom to have more experiences that, light up your soul and spend less time doing the job that leads to the quiet desperation. I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer.
No, it is. It is, because we push on this show a lot that adventure can be had in between life and can be had in the same soul-changing, eye-opening experiences that you can have on a 6-month thru-hike. You can have after your 9 to 5 from 5 to 9. Some of my most eye-opening experiences were overnight trips, so we believe that the power of the outdoors and the power of nature can be had anywhere in the world and for any amount of time, even as simple as sitting under a tree and just watching it,
Absolutely.
Sometimes that's all you need. But Willow, I'm going to plug everything for out there. If there's anything besides that you'd like to share, please share. And I really appreciate you being on the show. But yeah, if there's anything besides that you'd like to plug, go for it.
I think you've got it. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on.
Yeah, and thank you for, telling the stories. I'm going to definitely ask our listeners to check out your show as well. It's so different from this show in a lot of ways and so enjoyable. We've had a lot of the same guests and people share their stories back and forth. So it's been cool to see y'all grow kind of out there in Wyoming and all over the place. So yeah, thanks for joining the Adventure Sports Podcast. It's a really fun crossover.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right, have a great evening and we'll talk soon.
Okay, sounds good. And I'll send you the audio I recorded. Feel free to use it or not, but it should be nice and clean. So if it's helpful.
That is super helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome to it.
Yeah, just
All
whenever
right.
you get to it would be great. All right.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye.
All right, bye.
First of all, thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us that you choose to listen to the show. If you'd like to help us further, you can leave a review on iTunes, share us with your friends, your family. It goes a long way to grow in the show. You can also support us financially through patreon.com/adventuresportspodcast. Link is in the show notes. And also, if you have an idea of who could be a good guest for the show, we're always looking for people to tell their story about the outdoors or adventure. So if you know someone, please reach out. Email us at info@adventuresportspodcast.com. And until then, get out there and have some fun.